Hey everyone, I just played Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy, and it was cathartic. You wouldn't think so to look at it. If you've been living in a cauldron these past 7 years, in Getting Over It you do exactly that. All you have to do is climb to the top of a mountain. Only the mountain is made of store-bought assets arranged into an impossible landfill landscape, and you may only reach the summit through swings of the sledgehammer clutched tight in the hands of our protagonist. There are no checkpoints, no save states, no shortcuts, no safety nets. Every fall is final. In other words, it's the perfect game to watch someone else play. The frustrations, the freakouts, the lines drawn in the sand by content creators driven mad, that's the real appeal, right? It's a cow to be milked, a dead horse to be beaten, hammered flat until the summit is reached or interest retreats. There have been many streamer bait rage games to grace digital storefronts over the past 10 years, but Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy is the only example of the genre I've ever felt compelled to play myself, and I want to talk about why. But before I get my hands into the guts of this game, there's something I need to make clear. If you've come to listen to me scream and rage at the Devil's Chimney, or Orange Hell, or This Friendly Snake, I'm sorry to say you won't find that here. My other, longer videos will scratch that itch much better. Let's get to it. Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy released at the tail end of 2017, but its story begins much earlier in 2002 with the release of a free flash game called Sexy Hiking, made by a Czech developer named Jazuo. In that game, you played a weird little guy holding a clip art hammer, and much like Getting Over It, your goal was to reach the summit of some nonsense garbage mountain. It's harder to get a hold of these days now that Flash is dead, but if you can track it down, you'll find a game that is unapologetically prickly. Not a forgotten classic, or even an uncut gem. No, Sexy Hiking is a lump of stone with the promise of a diamond hiding somewhere inside. It's an ugly game with bizarre mechanics, but it resonated with some who played it, including Bennett Foddy, because for everything it got wrong, it got the vibe of mountain climbing right. And that comes across, even in the few moments I spent with it during the making of this video. I believe it was Lee H. Whittlesey who wrote in Death in Yellowstone that you can't take the wild out of the wilderness. The mountains are not there for you. Stairways and trails are conveniences we force upon the landscape. There's no such thing as a naturally occurring paved road. The mountains of the world were here before everyone watching this video was born, and they'll still be here long after we die. We like to think, at least in the West, that we've, if not tamed the landscape, then perhaps found equilibrium with it. All the European and American explorers of centuries past who died filling in the blank spaces left by the erasure of First Nations maps did all the hard work. These days, what is there to be worried about with a little hike? Of course, the truth is the landscape will happily kill you without a second thought if you approach it unprepared, and sometimes even if you do arrive composed and ready to go. Just look at the bodies lining the trails of Mount Everest. Just look at the missing 411 conspiracy theory. Progress is not guaranteed in real-life mountaineering, nor is success, and there's no chance of a second attempt if you take one fatal misstep. Bennett Foddy says as much in Getting Over It, but artificial mountains are the complete opposite. To reach the top is often the entire point, so while sculpting digital ranges, it is often polite, expected even, that you add in handholds and trails and slopes and checkpoints along the way. Hidden, of course, you don't want it to be too obvious, but you don't want it to be too challenging either. Getting Over It rejects that style of digital landscape, and in doing so creates a mountain much closer experientially to one in real life, despite being made up of store-bought assets arranged like a frozen explosion. The man in the pot can't die, or at least not from fall damage, but he can drop all the way back to the beginning of the game from practically any point on the climb, and that's why it makes for such good content. Each swing of the hammer keeps you on tenterhooks, tends to express joy whether the player reaches new heights or plummets down to familiar depths. There is no bad outcome here, just cheer. And though the player might scream or stare at the sight of the man in the pot dropping away through coloured skies, we all know after a few moments of shock they'll pick themselves up to try again. The moment is long gone now, but I remember when Getting Over It was fresh and new, before it had even released on Steam. People were playing it on Twitch. I still remember the first time I saw the game on the Northern Line Live Super Show. I'd survived my work shift that morning, and I had the afternoon to myself, off, and here was this weird new thing on the NLSS, as unknown to them as it was to me. No one knew the shape of the mountain back then. No one knew how high it reached or how hard it was to summit. None of the sections had names until this first wave of curious streamers picked up the hammer and started swinging their way to the top. There was as much joy in the discovery of the mountain's shape and the act of conquering it as there was in watching the man in the pot drop back down through places Northern Lion and the others had already struggled through. Time differences prevented me from watching it all unfold live, but even a few hours behind, it felt so real and special, in a way that few streams ever have since. I remember watching Northern Lion struggle up the opening section of the game for hours. I remember watching the Devil's Chimney get its name. I remember watching Rockley Smile discover the bad ending before it was known you could get one, even to Bennett Foddy himself. He actually patched in voiceover for it after word spread you could completely balk your run right at the very end of the game by trapping the head of the hammer on the other side of the communications tower at the very top of the mountain. It was a dialogue between developer and streamer and audience, and it was beautiful while it lasted. The joy of climbing into undiscovered country may have faded, but there's still fun to be had in watching someone else tread that now well-worn path for the first time. The mountain's shape is known in full now, but that makes it no less difficult to summit. As for my own experiences with the game, they came years later, and when I finally did pick up the hammer, it played pretty much exactly how I always imagined it would. Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy is mechanically a very simple game. You use a mouse or a controller to swing the hammer, and that's pretty much it. The complexity comes from how you swing it. Big wide sweeps can fling you great distances, but also send you hurtling to your doom if you're not careful. Gentle drags and short hops can help with positioning, but can go very wrong if you're on awkward terrain. Huge raking swings make you feel powerful, but they're just as dangerous as any other movement in the game. Frantic flailing is to be avoided, but it does have its uses when you're up against a wall trying to scramble away from an open-air drop. It's a surprising array of movement for such a simple mechanic, and the complexity only increases with the different materials you find yourself forced to traverse. Everything is slippery in its own way, metal like it's covered in water, rock like it's loose gravel. It's the only aspect of the mechanics I find difficult to describe. It's really something you have to experience firsthand to understand. The game's even happy to throw some moving parts at you, like this orange, or this big hat on top of the church, or this gift that drops out of the sky if you take too long and screams at you if you take the bait and touch it. One moving part is even essential, this swinging bucket up by the snake with which you need to launch yourself up to the next area. The snake takes you all the way back down to the start of the game if you accidentally hook onto it, but you already knew that. It's a cruel joke at the player's expense in a game absolutely full of them, but it's also a fun little nod to snakes and ladders, and it can be both, that's okay. I've never actually taken the snake myself. Having watched the game played so many times before I stepped up to attempt my own climb, I knew to avoid it. To me, it's just a weird thing along the ascent, a nose to boop a couple of times with my hammer for good luck before hopping up onto the swinging bucket. The recording you've been watching this whole video is actually my second playthrough of the game, and I completed it in just over 2 hours. I originally hoped I could get through the game in around 30 minutes so I could bash out a script of the same length, and then slap the voiceover on top of the recording without having to edit a single second of the video, but that didn't happen. The climb is still a little too steep for me, although it was certainly easier than my first attempt. When I first sat down to play the game back in 2019, I believe it was with a friend, the same friend who introduced me to the Men in Black game. It seemed only fair after he introduced me to a title of such quality. We took turns trying to get through it for a couple of hours, and then moved on, but something about Getting Over It hooked me. I had to keep playing on my own, and after 7 hours of misery, I finally made it to the top. The funny thing is, I don't remember anything about that original playthrough, and yet I didn't have to relearn the controls or the mechanics. It was all still there, ready to go. I still struggled. There were still moments of tension, moments of tedium, the satisfaction of reaching the summit, the terror at the thought of having to climb back up through orange hell if I fell, all things I'd felt before, but what I didn't expect to feel was joy. One of the sections I got stuck at for a while was the first jump of orange hell. The The climb up from Child Slide is enough of a struggle, but the hop up to catch the rocks beneath the rectory is easily the second hardest jump in the game for me. It was one of those situations where the climb back up to it was always more annoying than the actual attempt itself, something I spoke a little about in my previous video on Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. In that game, there's a long section of platforming that ends with a difficult jump that I was never able to complete. The jump itself was frustrating enough, but it was the 3-minute climb back up for another attempt that really made me hate that section of the game, enough so that I downloaded a save file from beyond that point just to get past it. Getting Over It has a lot of moments like that, but for some reason they didn't get to me the same way, and this particular time I'd spent way more than 3 minutes climbing back up to Orange Hell for another attempt at the rock hop. The first time I'd reached this part of the mountain, I'd rather spitefully knocked away the orange sitting on the table to give myself some space, thinking, foolishly, that I'd get it on the first attempt. I did not, and now, half an hour later, here I was, ready for another try. I knew exactly what I was going to do in my head, but I needed to be on the table first. I swung over to take position, but instead of landing on the table, I hurled myself right past it, over the edge of Orange Hell, right back down to Child Slide, and I burst out laughing at how bad a swing it was. Only the fall didn't stop. I kept going, slipped through the gap between Child Slide and the barbecue, and suddenly I was down in the starting area right next to that damn orange, which the hammer then got caught on, and I was sent hurtling even further, almost to the very bottom of the mountain. I was already cackling from the first whiffed swing, but that little moment of cosmic vengeance when the orange tossed me aside made me laugh so hard I nearly threw up. And then, once the moment was over, I started the long climb back up again. On my first playthrough, I think that moment would have been enough for me to need a few hours away from the game in order to calm down. The Steam page boasts that Getting Over It will make you, quote, feel new types of frustration you didn't know you were capable of, end quote. And that was true the first time I sat down to play it, but those frustrations are familiar to me now. A comfort, a catharsis. I'm a very angry person by nature, especially on my own. When I stop working, I start thinking. I need some sort of project to distract me, or else my mind will wander off to Rage Town on its own. I don't even need something bad to have happened. Sometimes the mere absence of an occupation is enough to get me worked up. 1 or 2 comments I've received over the years have asked why I subject myself to reviewing such terrible games. And this is why. It's a way to vent the pent-up anger that doesn't hurt anyone, that's even productive. Rage games don't often fulfill that need. They're usually too cruel or too unfair to be anything other than miserable. Getting Over It is the exception. Recently I found myself in need of catharsis, and Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy just happened to be there when I did. Not just as a way to blow off some steam on Steam and make a quick filler video in the process while I work on other bigger projects, but as a way to think about things. Getting Over It might be known today as a shining example of a streamer bait rage game, but Bennett Foddy actually has something to say as you make your way up his mountain of asset flip trash, and for that reason it will always appeal to me more than games like Jump King or Pogo Stuck or Only Up or Alt F4. Getting Over It is an interactive essay on complacency in video game design, an examination of the zeitgeist and the speed at which it can change, and self-evidence of how spite can be as powerful a motivator as ambition. Foddy's commentary never interrupts the act of climbing, but it does serve to mark your progress. A bad fall will sometimes get you a quote or a public domain song, or a tee-hee, did you just make a mistake kind of comment, but only by climbing higher will Bennett Foddy actually continue his monologue. The speech is lyrical in a strained kind of way. The rhythm is there, but the words fall short. Like everything in the game, it's rough, unrefined, unrelenting. For every time Bennett slides into a screed on the inconstance of culture capped with a pair of rhyming couplets, there's a counterpoint of craziness where he likens the player to an acrobat who could swallow a baseball bat. But the form of the thing is immaterial. What matters is the message, and that's made clear from the very first words spoken in the game.
There's no feeling more intense than starting over.
And it's one thing to say that, and another to know it, but it's something else entirely to experience yourself, to have reaffirmed, especially through gameplay. And it's something that needs to be reaffirmed again and again, or at least it does for me, because it's also very easy to forget or ignore. Even Bennett Foddy falls for the trick when he says,
A funny thing happened to me as I was building this mountain. I'd have an idea for a new obstacle, and I'd build it, test it, and it would usually turn out to be unreasonably hard. But I couldn't bring myself to make it easier. It already felt like my inability to get past a new obstacle was my fault as a player rather than as a builder. Imaginary mountains build themselves from our efforts to climb them, and it's our repeated attempts to reach the summit that turns those mountains into something real. When you're building a video game world, you're building with ideas, and that can be like working with quickset cement. You mold your ideas into a certain shape that can be played with, and in the process of playing with them, they begin to harden and set until they're immutable, like rock. And at that point, you can't change the world, not without breaking it into pieces and starting fresh with new ideas.
The metaphor of climbing a mountain to some level of success isn't a new one. It's why we say someone's at the top of their field or at the top of their game, a cut above, on top of the world. Nor is a bad fall a new metaphor for failure. We've all hit rock bottom at least once in our lives. We've all ridden the snake back down. It's as subtle as the swing of a sledgehammer, but it works because it's true. Sometimes Garth Marenghi can be right too.
I know writers who use subtext and they're all cowards.
I never set out to be a YouTuber. Like Garth, I'm a writer at heart. The industry likes to slap labels on authors as aspiring, emerging, established, but I refuse those categories. If you write, you're a writer, published or not, and I'll continue to write, published or not, until the day I die. Because if I can't find the books I want to read on store shelves, I will force them into being out of spite. But passions ebb and flow, doubts rise and fall, and it can feel like the end of the world to receive the wrong response from a publisher or an agent at the wrong time, when you're stressed or depressed or just having a bad day, and there's no use complaining the lack of explaining why the rejection came. It's draining. But the itch always returns my fingers to the keys, whether it takes a week or a month or a year. I'll be back. That's part of the reason why I burned out on book reviews over on my other channel. It's hard to get excited about reading novels when the gatekeepers tell you no one wants to read yours. But the itch always returns my eyes to the page. Whether it takes a week, a month, a year, I'll be back. The publishing industry isn't the only one to make you jump through hoops for your space on the shelf. They're all like that. That's why I'm here on this channel reviewing video games. That's why you're here watching me too. It's an escape for us both. A loophole of creative expression that is yet to be closed. Most games these days understand that. They know they're fighting for your time, and so try to make themselves as approachable as possible. The AAA industry stands for accommodate, advertise, appropriate. But Getting Over It rejects that philosophy. It turns its gaze back to when games were new and rough and hard. It makes you jump through hoops. It litters the climb with obstacles and scares, and if you fall, it bombards you with a few snide words, or a condescending tune, or a backhanded word of encouragement. In that regard, it's a metaphor for life as well, for climbing not just mountains, but any one of the artificial structures of business or culture the human animal has unwittingly caged itself within, at least for now. And that's the point. If the achievement is to be real, so must be the struggle to earn it. There's no easy act of creation, no tool to skip the parts you're unskilled for. Art and culture need that human element. Without the intent, it's just garbage.
For years now, people have been predicting that games would soon be made out of prefabricated objects, bought in a store and assembled into a world. And for the most part, that hasn't happened, because the objects in the stores are trash. I don't mean they look bad or that they're badly made, although a lot of them are. I mean they're trash in the way that food becomes trash as soon as you put it in the sink. Things are made to be consumed and used in a certain context, and once the moment is gone, they transform into garbage. In the context of technology, those moments pass by in seconds.
And that's why I'm confident the fad about generative AI will eventually die, despite industry fuckheads willing to try, because it's soulless. Just like crypto, just like NFTs, just like whatever the tech bros cling to next, just like a lot of these asset flip games made on the cheap. The irony is Getting Over It has a lot of character despite being made up entirely of store-bought assets, and that's thanks to Bennett Foddy's thesis. Its human element, its challenge, its intent. There's an artistry to the arrangement of Foddy's mountain of trash that makes it cohere into something that feels whole and connected. It's a little like freeform jazz that way. There's no notes on a page for the players to read, but there's still music to be heard when they play. Foddy plays up a love-hate relationship with the player all through the game, and even beyond it. Getting Over It Steam page begins its About section with, quote, "A game I made, for a certain kind of person, to hurt them," end quote. And I've often wondered who that kind of person is, but personally, I don't think they exist. It can't be the people who complete the game. Bennett Foddy's expression of love for those who reach the top of the mountain wouldn't be there otherwise. I don't think it's for people who decide to step away from the game either. I don't even think it's for the people who watch the game played on YouTube or Twitch. Despite his comments on the subject in-game, he still released it to streamers early to drum up buzz. Maybe it's directed at the people who turn off the commentary, who see the mountain as something to be conquered rather than experienced, the ones who miss the point. I don't know. I think it's just a statement. A challenge shouted into the void for a certain type of person. You know the one. We're all thinking it. At times, the relationship between Foddy and the player reminded me of the relationship between Miles Teller and J.K. Simmons in Whiplash, two men passionate about music who grow to hate each other across the movie, but also find a strange, toxic respect. Within the game itself, as you reach the snake, Foddy says,
"We have the same taste, you and I. It's not ambition, it's ambition's opposite. An obdurate mission to taste defeat. You'll feel bad if you win, so I put this snake in for you."
The thing is, ambition's opposite isn't failure, it's idleness. Read between the words, and it's almost like he's saying, you could be out there doing something productive, getting over your own mountain of trash, but instead you're here wasting time on mine. When you near the very top of the mountain, Foddy even asks,
Have you thought about who you are in this? Are you the man in the pot, Diogenes? Are you his hand? Are you the top of his hammer? I think not. Where your hand moves, the hammer may not follow, nor the man, nor the man's hand. In this you're his will, his intent, the embodied resolve in his uphill ascent.
And there's truth to that to some extent, but it also got me thinking. Diogenes the Cynic was a Greek philosopher famous for being a massive troll. When Plato described man as a featherless biped, Diogenes reportedly showed him a plucked chicken and declared, "Behold, a man." Foddy asking you to question who you are in all this before providing his own answer neatly hides the simultaneous truth that ever since you hit new game, Getting Over It has been the one playing you. And that's how it feels sometimes in real life too. But that doesn't make the experience any less real. It doesn't break the game's spell. We can take fictional characters into our hearts. Why not a mountain of digital garbage as well? At the very top of the mountain you leave the world behind. You float between asteroids before a blanket of stars, up toward the ultimate secret of this strange little universe. As per Bennett's wishes, I won't spoil it here, but I will admit I was disappointed. The euphoria I felt as Diogenes climbed up into the heavens was reward enough. What lies behind this checkbox just couldn't compare. While making this video, I discovered Getting Over It had just received its own spiritual successor, A Difficult Game About Climbing by Pontypants. By the time this video is uploaded, the game will be out. You might even be watching a recording of it as I speak these words, but as I write them it has yet to be released. A Difficult Game About Climbing wears its love for getting over it on its sleeve, right down to the description on its Steam page. In it, the developer says, quote, "This game was created by one person, me. Hello. This game is inspired by Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy, which in itself is a homage, to an even older game, Sexy Hiking by Jazwo. I was certain that Bennett's game would spawn countless of new types of games in a similar fashion, that would present unique, focused, and yet simple challenges. I was disappointed to see that trend not materialize fully, and so took it upon myself to make this game, hoping to contribute to the spirit of a Foddian-type game genre." End quote. In an age where every success is followed by an army of imitators, the lack of Getting Over It clones is exceptional, but I don't think it's that surprising. Any game can be challenging, any game can be simple, any game can be made from trash, and a lot of them are all three of these things. But to make another Getting Over It requires love, requires heart, requires the willingness to commit to an artistic bit that means less than 10% of players will ever make it to the top. It wasn't content to rest on its challenge. It had something it wanted to say, and was willing to gate that message behind a skill ceiling. There's merit in that, and frustration. If you've ever bounced off the game, I don't blame you. Like with real-life mountaineering, to attempt the climb at all is impressive enough. Failure is a necessary part of life, unfortunate a truth as that is to express, but it doesn't have to be the only part of life. Starting over is harder than starting up, yes, but in time it does get easier, and you'll never know that for certain unless you try. That's the one thing Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy never says about its central thesis, but I think it knows deep down. In the era of the attention economy, where everyone fights for likes and subs and responses with disposable content that will one day be hammered flat into just another layer of humanity's cultural history, including me, like and subscribe by the way. Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy stands like a mountain against the storm. I love this game with all my heart, but I also understand why others don't. If you disagree with everything I've said and hate the game, that's fine. Not everyone has to like the same things or interpret them the same way. The world would be a boring place if we did. While doing voiceover pickups for my last video, I happened to record someone hammering away outside my window, and I dropped it in at the end of the essay just as a little joke. Who the fuck is hammering at 7:16 PM on a Sunday? Turns out it was me. When I needed a catharsis, to let off some steam, Bennett Foddy was there with a hammer and a pot and a few choice words to get me motivated. I got over the mountain, but I also got over that stupid lump of wrinkly bacon whispering shit between my ears. And if I can get over that now, I can get over it again. We can get over anything. Thanks for watching.
Going down the road.